The next on the agenda is a panel. And the format for the panel is that each speaker will have each panelist will have an opportunity to let you know a little bit about what they do, what they're interested in, working on, etc. And following each panelist's presentation, the floor will be open for Q&A. And so following all three presentations, the floor will be open. So we'll go through all of the panelists and then the floor will be open. The first presentation will be from panelist Alberto Akamazzi. Alberto is with the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, where he's been working on a variety of computing projects since 1989. In '93, he joined the NASA Astrophysics Data System, or ADS, project. And that's a digital library portal for researchers in astronomy and physics, and it's developed and maintained at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. In 2007, Alberto became program manager for the ADS and now leads the planning, development, and management of the system. He's the current chair of the NASA Astronomy Data Center's Executive Committee. He's prior chair of the International Virtual Observatory Alliance Interest Group on Data Curation and Preservation, and he's a member of the International Astronomical Union Division on Facilities, Technologies, and Data Sciences. And does that have a nice acronym? You have the floor. Not yet.
Okay, great. Can you all hear me? All right, so today we're going from agronomy to astronomy. It's a nice sound. So from the ground up, as we were commenting earlier. I wasn't certain about what the best format for my talk should be. So I thought that what I would try to do is have a few slides and then try to do a little bit of show and tell, showing some features of the system that we maintain and how it links with research data products and software in our community. So I think it's safe to say that the case of astronomy is quite different from what Sylvie was describing earlier within agronomy. And you will see in my talk how I will discuss issues surrounding data, products, archiving, and sharing, and preservation, and so forth. I would like to warn you from the onset that it doesn't necessarily mean that we got it all figured out as astronomers. On the contrary, there are some issues related to culture of sharing and archiving, of mid-level and highly processed data products that we're still struggling with. But let me get started with the general observation about our community, which, as Jim Gray used to say, has this nice feature that its data is virtually worthless. Nobody will buy astronomy data from you. So as a result, there's a culture of open access in general about the data that is collected by government-funded programs. There's big agencies such as NASA, the National Science Foundation, the European funding agencies that collect data using very expensive kind of big science projects and satellites like the Hubble Space Telescope. And then the purpose of this collection is to have this highly valued data used as much as possible for the purpose of furthering science. On the literature side, there's a similar situation where most of the core journals in astronomy are actually published by nonprofit organizations. And there again, their goal is not to make money, but is to further the science and discovery in astronomy. And as a result, almost across the board, all the literature in our system has this delayed open access model that has been running for a few years, even prior to any mandates by the OSTP and other European funding agencies. So we have an infrastructure where literature and data are, for the most part, available. There are funded archives in astronomy that have been set up to preserve highly valued, highly valued raw and processed data products. The Hubble Space Telescope is one of such an example. And then there are funded archives that are in charge of creating catalogs and collections out of the measurements that come from these large and expensive data sets. The project that I will talk about, the ADEs, is kind of shines in this last bullet point, which is it tries to harvest and collect in one place the connections that are made between science papers, the data products, and derived catalogs from them. So this is an activity that happens either before publication takes place, but increasingly as a curation activity in post-publication, in the post-publication world, so that through the collection of this information, which is created by different parties, one can actually, through a system such as ADEs, find out what particular objects are discussed in an article. So this is information that is available in machine-readable format. What observations were used to create the results or support the science discussed in the paper, and even has some keyword and semantic characterization of the kind of studies that was carried out in the paper. So the ADEs, which is the project that I manage, is best described as a disciplinary repository for astronomy and astrophysics content. We cover physics in so far as physics is the overall field in which astrophysics belong, and so given the fact that there is interdisciplinary studies that use data from other parts of physics, that becomes a necessity for us to do. What we do is we maintain a network of citations between papers in our system. We have over 11 million bibliographic records, even though our core astronomy collection only contains 2 million records. And again, the rest are other areas of physics, such as high energy physics and cosmology, which are of interest to astronomers. So we have great penetration in our community. There's about 20,000 active astronomers in the world, and we have much higher number of regular users, above 50,000. So there's, as I was suggesting, there's other people in other neighboring disciplines that use our system, and everything we do is indexed by the popular search engines. Wikipedia links to us, and so we're well represented in internet searches. Our mission essentially comes from the fact that we're funded by NASA, in particular NASA Astrophysics. So it's one of the science directors of the NASA program, and the kind of focus of the science that they want to promote is exposing and promoting the use of the data that is produced by the NASA Astrophysics program. So even though, again, our focus is the literature, we are kind of tasked with doing our best to expose the data that underlies all the studies that happen in our field, essentially. And the other part of it is that the realization that one of the best ways to do this is to actually providing services that then can be used by the curators who do the actual work of linking the data products to the literature. So these 4 bullet points kind of condense what we're trying to do. And we've increasingly kind of tried to cover more and more resources that are ingested or linked into our system. So of course we cover bibliographic data, and so we use different data providers to gather this information. Archive, run out of Cornell, is a big source of content. This is the so-called e-prints. So these are papers that are deposited in this open access repository prior to or as while they're being submitted to the referee journals. So we do all the work of correlating the published literature with the pre-printed literature, and also linking to data catalogs such as Vizier, which is maintaining a data repository in France. We also index observing proposals. So these are proposals that scientists submit to a funding agency or to NASA in order to obtain data from their telescopes or in order to obtain funds to conduct their research. And okay, so we collect data from a variety of publishers. We link to a software repository called the Astrophysics Source Code Library. So again, this is integrating curation work done outside of our system, but relevant to the research papers that we maintain. And of course, we track citations so that people can follow these, traverse the citation networks and discover interesting things. So this is a screenshot from our kind of old interface, but still the one that most people are using today. Just to highlight one of these features, the data linking in our system. So as part of this very somewhat confusing menu of options that people are given, you can select this option of data link. So if you do so, you will retrieve papers that have some data associated with them. So this is data that ADS is aware of, and you can expect to find links associated with each bibliographic record to the data products that were used in the paper. And in addition to that, because we collect bibliographies from the different archives, one can then select one or more of the archives that you want your paper to be part of. So in this case, I am requesting that my papers be in the Hubble Space Telescope bibliography as well as the Chandra X-ray Telescope bibliography. So I'm giving this an example that it may be lost on people who are not astronomers, but by doing this, I'm basically looking for data products that have both an optical component, that's what the Hubble Space Telescope observed, and an X-ray component, that's what the Chandra X-ray Observatory maintains. So if I were to do this choice, it would be a good way to find multi-wavelength studies. And so I'm using the knowledge associated with the papers. I'm using data properties to guide my bibliographic search and retrieve the data I'm interested in. And of course, this is an example of one paper retrieved with the links to these data archives. If you click on one of those links, you actually go and you can download the raw observations. Each one of these is the name of a target that was observed by Hubble, and there's several files, actual raw files associated with each one of them. Our new interface tries to expose this in a little bit of a more user-friendly way. So we use facets or filters, as you can see. Here I've done a search. I didn't have to check any boxes, but as part of the search results, as part of the search results, I can now see that the bibliographic groups are displayed here. So I can use this as a filter to say I want papers that have CXC that are in this Chandra X-ray Center bibliographic group, or I can go directly to the data. These are name of data archives, and so I can select one or more of the archives to find the papers that have those data products. We also link to other repositories. So this has high-level data products. They're typically tables collected and published in the literature and collected by the Vizier project, which is run out of a French data center. And we also maintain some bibliographies related to the grants that funded the research. So this is not a complete, it doesn't completely cover our literature, but we have been maintaining a NASA bibliography. So these are the name of the grants that were given to fund the research discussed in the papers associated with them. If you look at the full record view, this is kind of the information that we have. This is kind of our data, which, as you can see, is a collection of metadata from a variety of places. So most of the information is about the article itself. But over here, you can see the link outs to the full text, the data products. Some of them are the raw data products. Some of them are measurement of objects found in papers. That's what these two are. And then we have links to what we call graphics links. So these are plots extracted from the paper itself. We have this for some publications that allow us to mine their text. And if you're interested, then we send you to the actual journal article from the publisher, which may or may not have data behind the figures available. So this is kind of a teaser, but it helps people figure out what kind of data might be available. Well, first of all, what kind of data is discussed in the paper? This is a collection of figures in that paper. And at this point, we don't yet know whether there's actual data in the supplementary material of the article, but you're just one click away from finding out if you go there. So why is everybody participating in this effort, I guess, which I guess is a big plus for us. Well, I think for the most part, our community has bought into the idea that linked data is used data, and papers that are data rich have an actual citation advantage, which is something that we showed in our study in 2012. My colleague Edwin Henneken ran the study, and we found that for papers in a sample taken from the astronomical journals, papers that had data link had a 20% citation advantage over similar papers on the same topic, same sample. This plot is a study by Rick White from Space Telescope Science Institute that actually shows that if you run a good archive, which is what they do, this is the archive of the Hubble Space Telescope data, over time, your archival data becomes the primary source of data products mostly used in publications. So in this case, he showed that in 2010, 321 papers were published from archival data as opposed to new data, so data currently being produced by the telescope. So this is data reuse at work right here. And Winkelman et al., who's also group working here at the CFA, at the Center for Astrophysics, showed that when a paper is published, it triggers download and reuse of the data products in their archive. So this does not just happen upon as soon as the data becomes publicly available, but it happens again. This is just for one paper. It happens again once an archival paper using that observation or set of observations is then republished. So basically, if you do this linking, everybody wins, and you get more usage out of your data products, and also, for the candy that is handed out to the researcher is the potential of having higher citation counts on his or her papers. So how is this done? Well, again, we have this network of services and archives available. First of all, there's an easy way, or somewhat easy way, to discover this content, right? You can use our system to find out what papers cite a particular telescope or instrument or observation IDs. So here I've done a search in the full text, and I can see that a particular observation ID from Chandra is cited in this paper. And so an archivist or a librarian can start creating a collection that connects this data product to a paper. Then, this is an example of the workflow that the librarians at the European Southern Observatory follow. If you have archives and systems which are interoperable, then you can build a system out of this discovery activity. So here's the example, without going through all the steps. Here it shows the use of a tool called Fuse that our librarian, actually Chris Erdman, originally developed, which uses our system to identify potential publications associated with the data products from that archive. These are ingested in a local database. They are annotated with additional data related to the data products and the proposals that were used to generate them. Then this go in the data archive. It's exposed through an interface specific to that archive, and then that bibliography is ingested back into the astrophysics data system, So the literature gets linked back to the data products through this process. How it's done, okay, there's obviously APIs that we provide for people to do that level of searching and retrieval of papers and fragments from the full text to find out whether there's data products available. Again, Chris Erdman, who's here, oh, he's right there. So training is a component of this, right? Kind of letting people know about these tools and techniques, and actually having librarians involved in the process of maintaining these bibliographies is crucial if you want this to become common. And so Chris has been running different workshops called Data Scientist Training for the Librarians. So a shout out to Chris for helping make this possible. And here's just an example of one other project that has been using this aggregate information from different archives. This is called the ADEs Allsky Survey. And Alyssa Goodman, who's a professor here at Harvard, is the primary scientist behind it. The idea being that mining information from the literature and connecting it with object databases, so databases that contain measurements of astronomical objects, can provide an environment where visualizations are used to discover parts of the sky that have been heavily mined or observed versus other parts that have not been yet studied as deeply. And depending on the type of objects that you're interested in, or depending on the kind of study that you're interested in, you can actually visualize some of this information in a visual tool and then explore by drilling down and going to see the actual science done. You know, so you have connections between the literature and the sky with easy way to go from one to the other. And here's just the screenshots. These are pretty visualizations that you can do in our system. So again, the upshot here is that if you've done everything that I've shown you up until now, and you have bibliography, a collection of bibliographies integrated in our system, then you can get not just a pretty visualization, but you can kind of get some intelligence and statistics out of your collection. So these are, I picked the highly cited papers from the Hubble Space Telescope, and then I said, okay, show me the co-authorship network. So here I'm basically seeing who are the scientists of the most cited studies in this field, and how each group has published over time. Here I'm seeing a collection of papers in diagrams that show different quantities plotted. One is publication time versus read count, which is a measure of readership, so popularity. This is a citation count. So you can actually get a lot of information out of this system and ask questions such as, how are scientists using the data in my archive? What are the topics that my data products what are the topics of the studies that my data products enable in the literature? Okay, this is my last slide. So what's coming next? So again, we haven't had it all figured out. Essentially, we have a lot of things that work and work well, but there's a lot of questions in terms of what things we should be working on. In particular, there's increasing pressure from the community to have all kinds of information be stored into our system. So ADS is an archive, has been the primary place where the literature is indexed. As more and more things are being cited in the literature, the scientists want to find that information in our system. So if it's indexed in ADS, you can find it. If it's in ADS, it also means that we can assign citations to those resources. So if you want credit for the software that you've written and other people are using now, or the data products that you've published and then now people are reusing, then it kind of has to be in our system. And there's this saying, if it's not in ADS, it doesn't exist, essentially, which reinforces this whole system. So we think this is a good thing, but there's the danger that, that it's hard to define the boundary of our scope and our archive, essentially. Journals are still they're coming along, still struggling somewhat about how to enrich their articles with more data and how to modify their policies so that data products are either required to be accessible or there needs to be some justification as to why the data product wasn't linked or supplied with the article. So I think this is something that will be worked out in the next few years. And for the archives, there is still a learning curve, I think, that relates to the issues surrounding data citations, how and whether and how archives should issue DOIs for part of their archival data, for entire collections, and so forth. But this is a discussion that is happening in other fields as well, and so hopefully, as a community, we can just adopt some of the best practices that are using in other places. And this is a collection of links to things that might be related are related to the things I showed you, as well as other presentations that I made about these topics. So I'm going to stop here.
You're next, right? Okay. Thank you, Alberto. The next panelist is Victoria Stodden. Victoria joined the Graduate School of Library and Information Science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign as an associate prof in fall of 2014. She's a leader in the area of reproducibility and computational science, exploring how we can better ensure the reliability and usefulness of scientific results in the face of increasingly sophisticated computational approaches to research. Her work addresses a wide range of topics and includes standards of openness for data and code sharing, legal and policy barriers to disseminating reproducible research, robustness and replicated findings, cyber infrastructure to enable reproducibility, the scientific publishing practices, etc., I assume. Stodden co-chairs the NFS Advisory Committee for Cyber Infrastructure and is a member of the NSF Directorate for Computer and Information Science and Engineering, directed that advisory committee. She also serves on the National Academy's Committee for Responsible Science, ensuring the integrity of the research process. You about up? You're ready to go. Lots of button punching over my shoulder. Just quickly, the last, she was previously at Columbia. She's taught on data science, reproducible research, statistical theory, and she was affiliated with the Institute for Data Sciences and Engineering. She's co-edited a couple books on privacy and big data and the public good, frameworks for engagement, and implementing reproducible research. You have a Ph.D. in statistics, all right. And her law degree from Stanford, yes. She also holds a master's in economics from the University of British Columbia and a bachelor's from the University of Ottawa.
Well, thank you, Professor Bruder. That was a very comprehensive introduction, and I really appreciate it. And I'm very happy to be here and delighted to be addressing you all. Actually, this is I feel like. Symposia like these are, I just look out and I see how they're gaining momentum and becoming this real central focal point for a lot of the intellectual engagement we're making around these issues and the spread and importance of the issues that we're discussing today. So in my few minutes, I was going to talk about reconceptualizing scholarly communication in the era of big computation. So as Sylvie mentioned, much of my work has focused on the impact of technology, particularly computational technology, on how we carry out scientific research, how we disseminate it, what should we be disseminating, what's the role of access to these objects that go beyond, for example, just the scientific article. So what I'm going to do in my minutes is talk about, sort of unpack that statement that I just made, and what do we really mean by technological change, and how we understand that can then shape and evolve our understanding of where we need to be going. So I break it into a few categories that I'll explain in more detail, but data collection and storage, computational power, software, and then I talk about communication basically because of the development of the internet as a technology in communication. And I believe each of these technological developments are very, very different in how they impact the scholarly record and how they impact research. Then after thinking about, or if you accept my framing of the technological changes, what I'd like to do is take a step back and then say, well, what really are we trying to do in scientific research? That's largely where I focus my efforts, but I think we could probably broaden this beyond scientific research. But what are these norms that we embrace and follow as researchers, and how do we understand the continuation of these norms given these technological changes? And then finally, what I'd like to do is just wrap this together into a conversation about how this impacts the scholarly record. So fundamentally, what I want to talk to you today about is how the notion of a scholarly record is changing for many reasons, including these reasons that come from technology, and how do we reconceptualize what the scholarly record is, or perhaps should be, and what's our role in supporting these changes. Okay, conceptualizing technological change. So it feels a little bit trite to say data is important in causing changes to this audience. However, let me break that down a little bit more. Okay, so it's not just changes in data in terms of volume, it's also changes in terms of types of data, and it's fundamentally, in some sense, reshaping the types of questions that we can ask as scientists and the types of questions we can expect to get an answer to. So it isn't just that we're doing more science better and faster, we're doing different types of science. So the example I have here is we have data where we have many more variables than we have observations. That never used to be the case. Most of our statistics and analysis is built on we have many more observations than we have variables, but we just collect and collect data, and it's transforming the type of research that we actually do. We're also, I think everybody is cognizant of massive increases in computational power, having a similar effect, although different in instantiation, by allowing us to do things like simulate an entire physical system, change the parameters, simulate it again, look at the output, brand new types of science, brand new types of questions and answers that again arise from these changes in technology, these massive increases in computational power. And when I say brand new, I mean like 20 years. So that's new in terms of like how quickly we can change things and in terms of how we carry out science. So I think probably everyone in the room knew and was aware of these two items. The one that I hear people talk less about is software. So I put a picture of Lior Patster, who's a professor in biology and mathematics at Berkeley. I just grabbed a screenshot off YouTube, and he's giving a talk here, and he's talking about the role of software and new digital scholarly objects in his biological research. And I put a quote there. He's saying, actually I think right when I snapped it, he's saying the software contains ideas that enable biology. And I think it's not just in biology. As a statistician, many of the methods, for example, that are used to analyze the data and draw inferences and create new knowledge are appearing only in the software. We can't write it up in the article. You can maybe do like cursory high-level descriptions, but you cannot get everything that went into the software and in the methods into the paper itself. So now we've got this new situation where bona fide scientific contributions are appearing only in the software. And where's the software? Well, we all know where it is. It's on, the researcher's laptop or something like that, right? And so there's this giant gap in communication. Now, this is again coming through these changes in technology, this very widespread use of software as a tool for research. Okay, I'll just mention also a couple of other impacts in technology, more to make the discussion complete. I assert to you that nearly all aspects of research are becoming digitized and on their way to becoming accessible due to the internet, even in areas that traditionally have not been particularly digitized. We're on this march thanks to the internet. I also believe that intellectual property law is coming to the fore in these discussions. So this is something that, at least in the scientific community, is relatively new. Many of our norms in science eschew property rights. We do research to uncover knowledge and make it available as a public good. And now sharing things on the internet and having things in a digital form means all sorts of intellectual property attaches to it by default, that we simply as a community have to face head on and sort out. This is one of my sort of specialty areas of research, but I won't spend a lot of time on it in this talk, just in the interest of time, but I'm more than happy to discuss it. Okay, so how can we conceptualize a framework for understanding the impact of these changes in technology and what that means for our roles in facilitating, supporting, archiving, sharing, creating a complete scholarly record. So I found it useful to think about aspects of reproducibility, for example. And I found it useful because it scopes the discussion. When you talk to a scientist and you say something like, share your data, or worse yet, there's a mandate to share your data, this is something that just, it sort of floats in the air to the scientist. What does that really mean? Does it mean all the data I've collected, all my raw data? Does it mean my final data that my results are based on? Does it mean every version of every data that we've kind of gone through in these intermediary steps? What actually counts as data? Are you talking about software, or are you talking about spreadsheets, or what? And so I found that saying, let's produce work that's reproducible. So your digital and computational research should be shared in such a way that others can actually reproduce the work. All of a sudden, that's tractable to a scientist. Okay, so now I know, or at least I have a general idea on what data needs to be shared and what aspects need to be shared if I'm going to have some other end user be able to chunk through my research and reproduce those results. And so these notions of reproducibility, and I'm sure you've also seen, there's been quite a few headlines over the last year or so, 18 months, around sort of crisis in reproducibility in scientific research. I've also found it very useful to think about different types of reproducibility. As we heard this morning, different fields are very different in how they are doing things like becoming digitized or integrating technology. They have very different norms in very different questions that they're asking. And just this broad concept of reproducibility, if we can sort of parse this a little more closely, I think it becomes a little more meaningful. So I found it very useful to think about 3 types of reproducibility. I just have them here, and I'll talk about them just like give you some examples in the next couple of slides. But I think it's useful to think about reproducibility in the sense of empirical reproducibility. So I have this little screenshot of an article in Nature reducing our irreproducibility. And the idea of empirical reproducibility is really, if you take out that technological component. So go back to the 1660s, Robert Boyle exhorting scientists to have a complete enough description in their article so that other scientists could actually go ahead and replicate the work and understand it without having to talk to the original author. So that's something that's a 100-year-old problem. It's not solved, but that's something that, that we've been dealing with as a scientific community for a very long time. So I would compare that with computational reproducibility. So this deals with these technological aspects. So now what do we do when we think about reproducibility for work that has a computational component? You're suddenly dealing with things like data, often very large data sets. You're dealing with things like software. How do you link those data sets to the actual paper in an intellectual sense? Well, you need those software steps that go through to those final results that are published. And so that raises a whole host of new questions that don't fall naturally in that category of empirical reproducibility that we've been talking about for hundreds of years. The final type of reproducibility that I think is useful to sort of make a distinction from the others is statistical reproducibility. So I won't spend much time on that in this talk, simply because I don't have a lot of time. But briefly, have you done a design of experiment where you would expect the results to generalize? Are your statistics sound? Have you done the right tests? And how generalizable is your analysis on the data, for example? Okay, so a couple of examples. Empirical reproducibility. So in Cell Reports, about a year ago, there was a short 2-page article. I encourage everyone to read it, called Sorting Out the Facts, the Devil in the Details. And what they talk about here is this is a collaboration between a lab at Berkeley and a lab actually here at Harvard. And they set aside in their collaboration, I think it was something like 2 months, to reconcile the different processes in the two labs so that they were producing identical outputs. These are biological outputs, so they had cell signatures that were coming out. And it took them 2 years to finally reconcile why there were still signatures that you could identify which lab the results actually came from. And it turned out that they just sort of had to break the process down, and this isn't my area of research, but if I understood the article correctly, one lab was using a centrifuge to mix, the other one was just kind of stirring the beaker. And that's what made the difference. And so it's even little things like this that where empirical reproducibility can break. And this doesn't mean that the science is wrong or that the researchers are negligent. It's just unbelievably complicated, the way to go through and get these results. And how to capture that information and transmit it to others is not trivial. I also put on the right-hand panel a workshop, National Academy's workshop from last year, reproducibility issues in research with animals and animal models, and I throw it up there because it puts an interesting lens on the reproducibility problem. If you're replicating experiments and your experiments involve killing animals, that brings in an ethical dimension that may not actually be present in replicating, say, for example, other types of experiments such as computational experiments and so on. And this is all very much in the sort of what I would think of as the empirical realm. So computational reproducibility, as I mentioned, I'm thinking about how these technological changes that I outlined are impacting research and dissemination, capture, archiving, preservation. And if we think about our branches of the scientific method, you hear all sorts of chatter for the last several years. All these technological changes are creating a third branch of the scientific method and a fourth branch of the scientific method. Well, I started thinking about what that really means, and maybe this is a basis for understanding what we mean by a complete scholarly record when we have these technological affordances in our research. So traditionally, we've had two branches of the scientific method that we all probably learned in high school. So the first branch is a deductive branch. So we have mathematics lands in there, formal logic, any type of deductive reasoning. The second branch, because clearly this is only going to give us a limited way to understand our world, the second branch of the scientific method extends to inference. So that's our statistical analysis of controlled experiments and really our empirical branch of the scientific method, where we can start to extrapolate from results in a way the deductive branch does not allow us to. So we hear this third branch of the scientific method from computational methods, big simulations, and so on. Fourth branch of the scientific method, all sorts of new science from data-driven discovery and massive data sets, for example. So the argument that I make and others make is that computation presents only a potential third branch of the scientific method, or data-driven discovery and all the sort of high-velocity data only presents a potential fourth branch of the scientific method. And let me explain why I think that's the case. So if we think about why we even have a scientific method, and why do we have controlling norms, for example, that separate scientific research from other activities that we might engage in, it's because we make mistakes. We're human beings. Science is a process of discovery, and it's all fraught with error. And what we're trying to do, and what the whole motivation of the scientific method is we're trying to convince you that I've done everything I can as a researcher to root error out of the process. So my results are as correct as I can get them. And in fact, much of the public facing aspects and the transparency aspects in science are really about giving an opportunity to do even a better job of rooting out error and catching mistakes. So in the deductive branch, so they've had hundreds of years to think, both deductive and inductive branch, they've had hundreds of years to think about what this actually means for scientific research in that branch. So in the deductive branch, you wouldn't publish a mathematical result without giving the proof, right? How you actually got there and why you think that's right. And that's a standard. I mean, you have a sloppy proof that's incomplete, you're certainly not going to get published. You'll get immediately rejected from journals. In the empirical branch, it's not quite as clean, but we have an entire machinery around how we structure hypothesis testing and how we go about an experiment. We have appropriate statistical methods, and in an analogy to the deductive branch, if you leave the methods section blank when you're trying to publish, it will be immediately returned to you. And that's the importance of showing those steps and why you think that's right, and being able to convince the community you've done everything you can to root error out of the process. So this claim that I have at the bottom here, computation presents only a potential third or fourth branch of the scientific method until we develop comparable standards. So that's where all of us come in. So I've also found it useful to think about this concept of really reproducible research. So my advisor was David Donahoe in the statistics department at Stanford, and he summarized this idea of really reproducible research, which came from Professor John Claerbout's lab, who was a geophysicist at Stanford. And the way he said it is that the idea of reproducible research, an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself. It's merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete set of instructions and data which generated the figures. So really what Donahoe is talking about here in his synopsis of Claerbout's approach to reproducibility is, what do we mean by a scholarly record when we have code, when we have data, when we have computation, when we have these technological aspects wrapped into what we're doing as scientists and how we're disseminating this research. So really what they're saying is that scientific article is not enough anymore. It doesn't comprise a scholarly record. And I make a little note here because I think it's illuminating, and someone will inevitably ask me the question, that you can think about reproducing results in two different ways. Both are very important in a computational aspect. One is, can I take, say, for example, your code, your computational steps on your data, and can I get the figures and tables that you publish in a paper? Another one is, do I get enough information from your description in your paper that I could say, for example, recode the software, or recollect the data, and come up with some similar enough, whatever that means, results. I think both of those ways of understanding replication or reproducibility are very, very important. If there are differences in my independent replication of your research, the only way I can reconcile those differences is if I was also able to chunk through your code from your data and get your results. Otherwise, we just don't know why we're getting different results. So we need this very deep level of transparency in the computational research that we're publishing. Okay, I won't spend much time on this, a little bit more on reproducibility. By the way, I should have mentioned my slides are on my website if you prefer to follow along at your own pace, and many things are hot linked in there, so you can just grab them off the website, but I won't spend too much time on statistical reproducibility. Needless to say, there are problems there too. Okay. Okay, so how do we contextualize these changes? So we all know these technological changes are happening. We also know that research for hundreds of years has carried its own sets of norms, goals, and expectations. And so my question is, can these long-standing norms, our traditional norms around science, guide how we start to think about and interact with these technological changes and understand, maybe even almost in a prescriptive way, what we should be doing? So I went back to Merton's scientific norms from 1942. Now, these are not without controversy in themselves, and there is no definitive set of these are the scientific norms. However, I put them out there because they're there, and they do capture some of the flavor for most of the research. So he mentioned a few. He said communalism, which I think he actually called communism in the olden days, but it kind of didn't last. Communalism, scientific results are the common property of the community. I think that's a fairly widespread norm, even if it's not always practiced. Universalism, all scientists can contribute to science regardless of race, nationality, culture, or gender. We're about results. We're not about interpersonal status, for example. At least these are the sort of theoretical norms. Disinterestedness, we act for the benefit of a common scientific enterprise rather than for our own personal gain. Originality, scientific claims contribute something new. And skepticism, scientific claims must be exposed to critical scrutiny before being accepted. I think we could probably have days of discussions about whether or not these map to what scientists actually do. What I'll focus on for the purposes of my last few minutes is skepticism. Scientific claims must be exposed to critical scrutiny before being accepted. Now start thinking about how those technological changes are impacting your ability to scrutinize the published work, and communalism, scientific results are the common property of the community. So those are the two that I'll focus on. Skepticism. So I mentioned Robert Boyle earlier. This is a picture of him. I believe that this norm around skepticism of results rather than sort of the trust and accepting of what other scientists are doing or presenting as findings, in a sense, leads to these notions of reproducibility. So skepticism requires that the claim can be independently verified. Maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be independently verified, but it could be. So that means we have to have transparency in the communication of the research, the entire research process that generated those results. And just a quick note that came from Robert Boyle and these older ideas from the 1660s that haven't really changed. How we implement them is changing, but the ideas haven't really changed. Okay, my final section, the impact on the scholarly record. So this has caused me to start to rethink what we mean by a scholarly record. Right now, I think if you just sort of asked a random researcher or scientist, we just probably run into hundreds of them just wandering around campus, what you mean by the scholarly record, and they would talk about, oh, it's the publications in the journals. That's our the record of the scholarly contributions. So I started thinking about this. There are many gaps, right? We just talked about software. We've been spending a lot of time talking about data. And so there are these huge gaps. Gaps in transparency, ability to replicate results, if that's your conception of the scholarly record. So somehow that's no longer mapping onto our scientific norms. So here's an idea that I put out there for discussion. Scholarly record comprises access to and or the ability to regenerate items relied on in the generation of results, or items required for independent replication and reproducibility. So I'm using these notions of reproducibility, verification, skepticism to say the scholarly record needs to encompass a whole lot more than what we expect and what we have right now in just the journal publications. Now we're starting to creep there, as we saw, linking data to publications and so on, but it's no longer a collection of PDFs. Okay, so what do I mean by these items? Items could be a lot of stuff. So in the digital context where I do much of my research, articles, text, code, software, data, workflows, research environment, details, all of these things that you would want to know if you're replicating the results or if you're trying to understand those results. Remember, mistakes can creep in everywhere at any of these levels. So all of this needs to go transparent. It also includes material objects like reagents, lab equipment, instruments, historical artifacts, probably historical text. I think that's harder, and I don't work in that area. However, that's also a very important part of being able to replicate and understand results. And I make a quick note here that what version you have of these different items, how you identify them is, of course, very crucial. There's, there's many people with the best of intentions who sort of correct a data set after work has been published on it, and of course, and the data sets is better when they've sort of made these changes and corrections. However, in my view, for the scholarly record, we need that version that generated those results. If that's really going to be in the scholarly record, we need that fixed point. So making those changes is great, but we still need to have that version that produced those results for reproducibility. Okay, I also mentioned, and I have a favor to ask all of you. So these are some of the responses that are coming mainly from the scientific community about how to deal with this. So people who are working with technology, do a lot of computation, work with data a lot, they tend to be reasonably talented at creating software tools, and so lots are coming out of the software community. There's basically 3 types that I see. Dissemination platforms, so I've been working, for example, on researchcompendia.org. Oh, and if you go to grab my slides, these are hot linked if you want to look at them. Some of them are just fantastic. And like IPOL, for example, I'm not associated with this, and it's a very wonderful way that people are publishing image processing algorithms and software in a reproducible way. The second one, workflow. So that's sort of dissemination platforms is sort of post-publication. So how do I associate code, data, these digital objects with the publication? Workflow tracking in research environments, these Tools really are sort of pre-publication. How do I go through my research and capture what I need to capture to get a reproducible scientific finding out into the scholarly record and into the community? And finally, there's these sort of hybrid embedded publishing. So how do I even deliver something a little more comprehensive than, say, a static PDF to you? How do I deliver you something that has maybe code data embedded in it that I can extract? So my task to you is, this is very incomplete. I would love it if you sent me other examples that, that you know about, particularly ones. So these are mostly coming from scientific community, particularly ones coming from library community. I know that Alberto mentioned a few that I probably should have up here, and I would love to make this a little more complete. My email is really easy, victoria@stodden.net. So thank you for that. There's many community responses around this, so this isn't an idea that I've only noticed, how we interact with these computational aspects of research. In 1999, there was a declaration at Yale. So I was involved in each of these, but as an example, so at Yale in 2009, a series of computational scientists got together and published this article, Reproducible Research, addressing the need for data and code sharing in computational science. So 6 years old now. At Brown University, there was an ISERM workshop at the end of 2012. And you can see this one over here, setting their default to reproducible in computational science research. By computational science, we mean any science or any research that uses a computer. We don't mean people only doing the big simulations and so on. If you're using a computer, say you even have, you know, a flat file of data and you've run a t-test on it, I put you in the bin of computational science. You're using these computational aspects, your stuff is digital, and it's got all these sort of issues around sharing and access associated with it that I've been talking about today. Exceed 2015, this is extremely washed out and you can't see it. However, there was a workshop around how to start to implement reproducibility at very large scale computing, for example, and that was just last summer. Okay, we all know the government mandate's pushing us towards not just more open access, but also towards access to data. They don't talk much about software. That's mainly IP reasons for that, and I'm happy to talk about that. However, I think that's a major gap. As you know, that's where I started my talk. Journals also jumping on board to solve this problem. In my opinion, not fast enough, and it seems to be very much the higher impact journals that are comfortable with code or data requirements visited upon their authors. I did a study on how quickly this was moving, and we're still, I would guess, probably 12 or 15% of journals, or maybe it's up to 20 now. Okay, and then it's not just us, and it's not just a conversation in this room, or a conversation in the scientific community. We're putting things out on the web. So we've got all this potential for crowdsourcing and public engagement of science. And right now, it seems to be largely the public collecting data or perhaps looking at telescope images. But it would be wonderful to open up that pipeline. The pipeline's not open. We have, it's difficult to get code associated with computational results, for example. It's difficult to understand this unless you're an expert in the field. And so imagine if we had reproducible research where smart high school students could get papers they're interested in and start running things and playing with things. It's not really possible right now, except in a few limited cases. And use, so we hear all this chatter about evidence-based, whatever it is, evidence-based policy, evidence-based medicine, and so on. What does that mean? And how do you know that's right? So if you put on your skeptical hats, as we've been the Robert Boyle style hats, maybe that should be all open and I should be able to understand how they got that evidence. Why do they consider it evidence? Is their inference being done correctly? Is it reproducible, for example? I mean, if we're using this in policy discussions, this is now a question in our democracy. Okay, so in conclusion, our stakeholders in this discussion, including all of us, largely we're acting independently. Different fields are doing things, and scientists in those fields are doing things in silos. They just don't know what's happening in other fields. I think there's a role for a larger discussion, for symposia like this that bring the different communities together and share ideas and build value and hopefully have some synergies from this interaction. And so I believe that our primary unifying concept in formulating our norm-based approach to changes in technology is really around questions of access. And these items that I enumerated, access to these items that are associated with scientific research, right now it's limited and growing. And I really think our sort of central sort of rallying cry really could be around access to these items, especially in support of transparency in the scholarly record. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Our third panelist is Miriam Posner. Miriam teaches in the Digital Humanities program at the University of California, Los Angeles. She frequently writes and speaks on digital humanities as well as on the history of technology, particularly the history of medical imaging. She has a book, Depth Perception on 20th century filmmaking, and that's currently under contract with University of North Carolina Press. She has her Ph.D. from Yale, and her Ph.D. is in film studies and American studies. Thank you. And you are set to go, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. Oops. So actually, you too can follow along with this presentation. There's a short link here, and all of the images, I think, unless I forgot, are linked to the URLs that I talk about. So thank you so much for having me here. It's really exciting to be here with all of you. You know, I spent a summer in Cambridge once working at the Cambridge Historical Society, so I know exactly where George Washington slept. In fact, I am going to try to not to keep you from your lunch for too long. But bear with me. I do have a few slides to get through. So I think I'm the designated humanist on the panel today, which is fun for me. I'm usually one among many humanists. But what I'd like to do today is to talk about the very specific ways that humanists think about data. And how that's distinct in many ways from the way that scientists and social scientists tend to think about data. It was fascinating to listen to these two presentations because there are some similarities, some meaningful differences too. I want to make the case that there are actually some very promising ways in which libraries can make some meaningful interventions in the humanities research life cycle. So we humanists have some very urgent data needs. Both for digital humanists and for what you might call a traditional humanist, although of course the distinction is increasingly blurred. So just to say at the outset that there are, in fact, people who specialize in humanities data curation, and I am not one of those people. A number of really talented people, including Trevor Munoz at the University of Maryland, and Katie Rawson at the University of Pennsylvania have started to take a very programmatic look at the data curation needs of humanists. And I encourage you to check out particularly their data curation guide for the humanities. But you do not have Trevor or Katie here today, you have me, alas for all of us. But what I can do is share my own perspective and experience on what it means to work with data as a humanist and where I think libraries could help. So, am I echoing? Well, pretend I'm not. So, oh, that's what it is. Oh, I'm highly decorated today, so I think that's part of the problem. So I will start with an anecdote, and I imagine anyone who does digital humanities project consultation has something similar to share. Humanities scholars will often come to me wanting to do some kind of visualization, and they'll describe something elaborate that involves, graphs and charts and maps and movement over time and space. And I will say, great, let's look at your data. And they will say, oh, I don't have any data. This is very common, and it's not because we're stupid or naive. It's that humanists have in many ways, a very different way of engaging with evidence than most scientists or even social scientists. And we have different ways of knowing things, I think, than people in other fields. So we can know something to be true without being able to point to a data set as it's traditionally understood. And we can know, to take just one example from my field of early film history, that early silent film relied on the conventions of theatrical melodrama in order to make itself legible to early film audiences. We can know that without having a spreadsheet to support our claims, because we've immersed ourselves so deeply in these films and in the milieu of this period that we're attuned to its nuances. So that's why humanists sometimes think that you can make a data visualization without data, because they want to illustrate ideas and movement and not necessarily data points as we've been talking about them in this room today and yesterday. In fact, very few traditional humanists would call their source material data. You may have seen this piece in the LA Review of Books in October 2012. And while the language is pretty hyperbolic, I do think that it helps to convey how uncongenial most humanists feel the notion of data is to the work that they actually do. So the word seems really alien to humanities scholars, and I think that there are actually some pretty good reasons for this. When you call something data, you imply that it exists in some form in discrete, fungible units, that it is computationally tractable, that its meaningful qualities can be enumerated in a finite list, that someone else performing the same operations on the same data will come up with the same results. And this is not how humanists think about the material they're working with. And it's not a perfect analogy, but imagine that someone called your family photograph album a data set. It's not inaccurate per se, but it suggests that this person fundamentally doesn't understand why you value this artifact. And it's the same with humanists. With a source like a film or a work of literature, you're not extracting features in order to analyze them for the most part. You're trying to dive into it like a pool, like a swimming pool, and understand it from deep within. So let's take my silent film example again. It would be possible to enumerate all the filmic conventions that recall the conventions of melodrama. So is there a villain? Is there a heroine? Are good and evil depicted in stark black and white terms? You could even build a data set like this and use it to show how film changed over time. But seriously, who cares? It just, the information it conveys is so impoverished compared to the actual film, which we can in fact watch. And it's so much less interesting than the trained judgment of someone who's seen many of these films and can turn a nuanced observation of these changes into a real argument. So, and I would argue that the notion of reproducible research in the humanities just doesn't have as much currency the way it does in the sciences, because humanists tend to believe that the scholar's own subject position, who am I, what is my theoretical training, what is my background, is inextricably linked to the scholarship she produces. So Victoria and I could sit and watch the same corpus of silent films and each emerge with a very different perspective, each equally valid. However, so things are changing. I'll pause this, much as it pains me to do so. Things are changing in ways both obvious and not. All of our stuff is on our computers now, all of it, from books to movies to archival documents. And this is why, more than anything else, I think digital humanities is probably here to stay. If you can analyze something computationally, I think it's going to be really hard to tell people that they shouldn't. And this state of affairs has created some real problems for humanists, and I would say some real opportunities for libraries. If you speak to any historian who works in an archive, I guarantee you that they have hundreds, maybe even thousands of photos shot in an archive that are organized like this. This is it. This is how historians are organizing hundreds of archival photographs. And the best organized among them are trying to manage these irreplaceable documents in iPhoto. And incidentally, this is a big problem for me as someone who works on the history of lobotomy. Yeah, it's not just historians. It's not just historians who have a problem. Literature scholars, film scholars, everyone's dealing with a lot of journal articles, video clips, and other sources, and are really struggling to organize them so that they can produce scholarship. So humanists, even those who aren't digital humanists, desperately need some help managing their stuff, and libraries are actually in a great position to help them. And I do feel that this is actually an underexplored opportunity space for libraries. It's just that if you advertise these services as data management, they'll have no idea that you're trying to talk to them. I used to offer a workshop on managing research assets, and even that felt way too clinical to a lot of to describe humanist sources. But if you get a chance to look at the blog post linked here, you'll see that we're cobbling together dozens of tools, none of which really do what we want them to do. So all of that is to say that even if they don't call their sources data, traditional humanists have some pretty pressing data management needs. But the need becomes even greater when you're talking about people who consider themselves digital humanists. That is, people who use digital tools to explore humanities questions. So in many ways, digital humanists will have similar data needs to scientists and social scientists. They'll have spreadsheets, images, video, and will probably at least know what metadata is. In addition, the NEH Office of Digital Humanities, like the NSF and other funding agencies, now requires a data management plan. So you will very soon encounter, if you haven't already, I'm sure, a humanist approaching you at the 11th hour with a request that you write their data management plan for them. And just to give you a sense of how humanists might work with structured data, I'll show you a few examples. I mentioned earlier that I study the history of lobotomy, among other things. And one thing I was interested in doing was understanding how visual evidence changed over time. So with a lot of trouble, my IP address was actually blocked at several points. I obtained PDFs of every journal article from the Journal of American Psychiatry from 1910 to 1970. And then I used a computer vision library to extract all of the images from the journal, which resulted in about 3,000 images. I then hand tagged the images according to a very simple classification system that I devised, and finally built some visualizations to show how the distribution of evidence had changed over time. So among the things that I found was that charts and graphs have always been the favored form of evidence among psychiatrists, and that the use of images in the journal reached a high point around 1930, which was when developments from the emerging field of neuroscience began to change the field. So it was an argument informed by quantitative evidence, which I just couldn't have made without computerized sources. In fact, I had tried to do this just a few years ago when I was writing my dissertation, just simply by counting images, and I had given up. But it also relied, of course, on my trained judgment as a historian to understand why any of this was significant in the first place, because on some level, who cares, like that there are brains in a journal. So I'm gonna move past the next example, but I do encourage you to check it out. It's something that my student did on the emerging notion of authenticity as applied to frames, picture frames in his case. So that example that I just gave you is simple, but I think it does show you a little bit about how digital humanists are tending to work with data and where we need some help. First, we often find ourselves in conflict with publishers because of the kind of work we do. I mentioned that my IP address had gotten blocked, but this is actually mild compared to what has happened to other scholars. I definitely know people who've been threatened with lawsuits and the like for excessive downloading. Second, we're not generally creating data through experimentation or observation. More often than not, we're mining data from historical documents. So you name it, we have tried to mine it, from whaling logs to menus to telephone directories. And that means that we tend to want different tools than scientists, and also that we have some interesting data wrangling problems. More often than not, the categories that our historical sources use to divide up our data are not the same ones that we're interested in analyzing. So we often have to do some very creative transformations and interpretation. Third, it is just awful trying to find a humanities data set. There are various humanities data repositories or registries, but they're quite limited. And right now we're starting to see museums and cultural institutions release their data, and there's really no way to know who's released what unless you're the kind of person who likes to stay on top of these things. So we urgently need some help locating these data sets, aggregating them, and perhaps even linking them. Fourth, yes, we do need those web services that Saeed was describing yesterday that are built on top of existing data sets. We are working a lot with APIs, and it's really insufficient for us to download one record at a time. And even for people who aren't going to work with APIs, if you could build visualizations of data sets on the fly, just as we saw with the astronomical data, wow, or even just access the data in quantity, it would be a big help. Fifth, we have a desperate need for help with data modeling. And here is another place where I think librarians could play a big role. This July, I'll be directing a summer institute on digital humanities for art historians. And as I've been reading through the participants' project ideas, I've been struck by how often it seems that what the scholar really needs is data modeling advice. For example, the art historian who wants to show how and when art objects traveled across the Indian Ocean and relate that movement to corresponding changes in artistic practice. Well, what she really needs is a data model. The visualization is trivial compared to the complexity of this data model that can accommodate historical and artistic periods, geographic movements, conventional time versus parochial or cultural time. And most humanities scholars obviously are not trained to build these databases. But I think, or I hope, that this is an area where the library could actually be a big help. Finally, we may even need new kinds of data specifications. And I have seen that cartoon where it's like another data specification to rule them all. But the currently existing standards for describing time and space are actually really inadequate for our needs. To give one example, many standards for specifying date require time that's calculated down to the exact day and sometimes the minute or the second. But humanists, of course, tend to deal in things like circa or before or after or during. And two technologists at Stanford actually took on this problem with a project called TopoTime that I find really useful to think with. By specifying that certain characteristics or certain characters represent things like uncertainty, contingency, or approximation, they've shown how we could move from depicting time as a simple point or a line to a much broader canvas of shapes. So just as we need more nuanced data models for time, we find ourselves with a pretty limited palette of options for depicting important structures of power, like gender or race. Take the Union List of Artist Names, which is an incredibly important resource that museums use to establish authorities for artists. It's a wonderful resource. It's great that they just released it as linked open data, but look how it deals with gender. Now, the fact that it captures gender is crucial, but no self-respecting humanities scholar would ever get away with such a crude binary model of gender in her own traditional work. So for us, the proper mode of visualizing gender may not be a pie chart, it may be a heat map. So I don't know about you, but I actually find these problems to be quite interesting and challenging, taking the data sets we're given, which were not at all created for our purposes, and working against their grain or reinventing them to try to tease out the things we think are really interesting. It requires some soul searching about what we think data actually is and what its relationship to reality is. Where is it completely inadequate, and what about the world can be broken into pieces and turned into structured data? And I think that's why people who are into digital humanities think it is so fun and challenging, because you're always holding in your head this tension between the power of computation and the inadequacy of data to truly represent reality. And there's no one I know who knows this tension better than librarians. And so I would love to see libraries acting as true partners in the digital humanities research process. Thank you.
Yes, it's lunchtime, but there is time for a few questions, so please, questions. Everybody's going to refuse to ask a question. Do we need to wait for the mic, or?
Sorry, just pass it down.
So, Miriam, I'm excited to see you. I'm Chris Erdman from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, and I have a history degree. But I think we're always talking about how we would like to extend the astrophysics data systems to help other communities. Why don't we do this? I spoke with a colleague of yours, Adam Crimble, he's in London, I think, and he would say, he was telling me that his librarians didn't quite understand his needs, and so it was kind of funny. Here's this astrophysics librarian from across the Atlantic helping him with his data, and I think it would be great if we could help your needs, because we have a great tool. I think the astrophysics data systems. You saw the new one; it's great, right? So,
Beautiful.
yeah. And the data scientist training for librarians really responds to your needs as well, as sort of helping with the interlinking with data and other products, right? So.
It's really exciting to hear. It's really interesting to imagine the possibilities. And my sense, as someone who's kind of dived into scientific visualization, is that we tend to caricature it in the humanities as like, oh, they don't understand our nuances and contingencies. But in fact, there are very advanced and sophisticated conventions for depicting uncertainty and contingency and things like that within the sciences. So I think we could really benefit from that.
Additional questions? I have a question for where? Otherwise, I have a question for you. Okay.
I have 5
questions.
I'm sorry.
Starting with Miriam, I actually think there's a ton of overlap between how I'm a biologist by training, between that and digital humanities in terms of, sure, I could show you every single data set I ever created, because I did create them, but who cares? Like, there it is in the paper. Like, it's right there. And so I think that is really pretty fascinating to hear you say that, actually, in that way. Victoria, I'm wondering if you have any comment on the commercialization of academic science and how it relates to being a common good, both to the science community and to taxpayers, is how we're thinking about it now.
That's a great question, and I just didn't have time to dig into that, even though that's one of the areas where I do active research. So there's a huge amount of commercial pressure, I think, on scientists, and it comes from the university. I mean, everybody working at a university here, everybody signed this document when they started, saying that all their inventions are the property of the university. And how that gets instantiated at different universities changes. So some universities will say things like, you must report anything that might potentially be patentable to us, and we'll make a decision whether or not to patent, and so on. Other universities are a little more liberal with, you still should report it, but we'll work with you and we'll respect you as a researcher, your decision on what to do about this. And as you're noticing, Heidi, that goes right in, like, all this stuff about patenting and ownership is right against sort of open sharing, like what we might do as you know, naturally following our norms as science. And I won't go too much into detail, but I'm happy to talk to anyone about it. But that comes from 1980, and it comes from the Bayh-Dole Act that gave the universities the right to do this. And now it's very difficult to change because that's a perceived revenue stream for the universities. Whether it is or not is another question. It frequently is not. There's only a few universities that really have kind of like hit the lottery on that one. But however, it dangles out there. And so that's something that it's just not changing in the short term. And so one of the things that I'm very concerned about is, for example, software patents. So now something like what I was trying to make the case that we have real sort of intellectual thinking and contributions in software. So now what does this potentially go to the Tech Transfer Office for patenting, and then you have to ask permission to see this as a researcher who's trying to do things like replicate, extend, understand someone else's work. That just seems weird to me. And to any extent where data overlaps with patenting, we've got other issues in access to data. So I think, and I'm very glad you raised this, this is an issue that's it's already hitting us full in the face, and it's going to increasingly in the next, say, 2 to 3 years. So we should be ready for this. And my perspective is sort of digging in the heels and saying, well, Bayh-Dole's not right, and we should have all these public access. It doesn't get you very far because it's not going anywhere. And so strategically, I've been thinking about things like dual licensing agreements. So for example, if, let's just accept that stuff's going to go and get patented. I mean, really, there's stuff that's out of our hands, and that will probably happen at the university level. But maybe we can do things like say, okay, so commercial licensing and use from these patents, that's one thing, but let's have sort of clickable access by researchers to sort of make it mimic something like a commons that we would be used to in researchers. So, because I think it's just, if a researcher or scientist needs to just call up a tech transfer office at some other university, it's just not going to happen, right? It needs to be something that's streamlined and accessible and easy and so on. So being able to sort of parcel out those two uses, I think, might help preserve the revenue stream and also the scientific research. So that's the way I've been starting to think about it. But these are big issues that are going to come at us all.
Additional questions? Victoria, why has code why have we avoided talking about code in open access?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I don't know all the answers to that one. I think, but data has dominated the debate, or the discussions, not really the debate, the discussions around policy. It troubles me. I think software is as important an object, at least in the scientific aspects, but possibly everywhere, depending. It's a first-class object, the digital object, scholarly object, the way data is. And sometimes when I raise this issue, people say, yeah, but you know, when we talk about data, we also mean code and software, and it's all kind of, but it's not. It's really, really different. And data, it evolves differently. You would version this differently. You use it differently in research. Software, successful software is almost continually evolving in different projects, and it branches in different ways, and it just requires different platforms of support. You version differently. Everything's kind of different in there. And so lumping it all in one, I don't think is great. And also, why would you call data software when it has the name software and data has the name data? Like, it just doesn't even make sense. And so what's going to happen is software gets forgotten about, right? So you set up structures for data, and then they start looking like that list of images or whatever, right? And you can see how software wouldn't work in that list of images. How does it even mean? You know, you have like a bunch of files in there or something. And so how do you do things like create a community around it and so on? So, so that's not fully answering your question. That's describing the problem. I think somehow data is more tractable for people who maybe aren't deeply steeped in computational science, or they're not practicing and using software all the time. I think data is sort of easier for folks to sort of wrap their mind around what it means as an object. I mean, we all have data. We have our personal financial data. We all kind of have data. Not everybody has, say, for example, built Python scripts to analyze the data. So it's just one more step removed from sort of where people's comfort levels are, maybe. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just maybe they didn't need it for their particular work, and some scientists need it, so they develop those skills. And so I think it's just a little more foreign, perhaps. And then there's a very practical reason why it's not coming out, which you see in the 2013 OSTP memo around open data, open access. Where's the open software, right?
Yeah.
That's by Dole. And that's the patentability of software, that they can't touch it in the same way they can touch data. So it's up to us as a community to sort of bring that with it. They can't do it, and they can't pull us on that.
Yes, follow up.
Sorry, I promise it's short. Software is a little messier to deal with, from what I can tell, and part of it is that it's embedded in a workflow that the scientist follows. So it's not as simple as packaging and putting something out. There's issues about versioning, intellectual property rights and so forth.
What order did you use the software functions in and things like that?
Right. And then there's some stuff that still make the whole workflow or essential, what goes along with the software, which is often configuration and local things that make it real difficult. There was a joke that a true story, that some spectra taken from one of our telescopes could only be properly reduced if you used one workstation in a department, because it was properly configured with all the calibration files, et cetera, to do it. So it was so difficult to, reproduce that elsewhere, that people were just going to one place, because that's, you want to get your job done, basically. So that's all.
It is hard, yeah. But that's a reason to dig in, not to shy away.
Any last questions? Adjourn for lunch?
Great.
Thank you, panelists.